Hello, this is Michael McCarthy, and in this video we're going to take a look at simulating liquids using Phoenix FD. So to start simulating our liquids, we're pretty much going to set up everything as you would if you're simulating flames or smoke. And that's one of the nice things about working with Phoenix, is you don't have to learn a bunch of other tools to simulate liquids as well. So we're going to start off by going to create Phoenix FD and just creating a simulator here in the viewport. So we'll drag this out, something like that, and just zoom in. And the next thing we'll want to create is our object to emit fluids from. So I'm going to create a cylinder. And let's just rotate this slightly, about 90 degrees. We'll move it into place so that this is kind of a a pipe or something like that that we're going to emit all of our fluids from. So we want the fluids to kind of pour in from here. Now we're going to go to Create Helpers, Phoenix FD, and we'll create our source. So click and drag on the source, and in the Modify panel, we're going to pick that cylinder as our source. Now in the source we'll want to adjust a couple of things to be appropriate for emitting liquids as opposed to flames and smoke. One thing will be to drop the temperature quite a bit. We're going to drop this temperature down to 300, and that's not going to produce any visible temperature. It's basically just going to be a neutral value for this volume. Next thing we want to do is make sure that the fuel is set, because this is what we're going to simulate our liquid as. The value of 1 is going to be just fine for right now, although you could adjust it to be whatever it is that you want. The last thing we're going to do is set the polygon ID. That's going to allow the liquids to emit from just the cap of this, and by default the cylinder has a poly ID of 0 here, 1 here, and then 2 on the back. So we're going to set this to 1 so that the fluids will emit from that area. Now that we have our basic source set up, we can go back into the simulator and set up a couple things there. If we try and start simulating right now, we won't see anything as far as our fluids or really our fuel emitting here. And that's because we need to make sure that in the output section, we have checked fuel so that that will be output into our grid. So let's check on fuel. And now we can go ahead and start our simulation. So we'll click on Start, and we can kind of start to see our fluid or fuel come into the volume. Now right now it's really coming in more like smoke or a firewood in a kind of neutral environment. So we need to set this up to be actually a fluid. To do that, we're just going to go down to the liquids rollout, and in here you can see liquids are disabled. If we click on disabled, there's a couple of channels that we can use for liquid: temperature, smoke, or fuel. We've chosen to use fuel, although you can use temperature or smoke if you wish. So I'm going to click on fuel, and then we'll go back up to simulation and start again. Now you can see the liquids are kind of dropping in and behaving much more like liquid. One thing you can notice is there's a lot of turbulence in the volume right now, and that's something we want to adjust in the dynamic settings. So I'm going to click on stop here, and I'm just going to scroll down to dynamics. We'll click the vorticity, set that down to 0 so that we have a much less turbulent field going on in there, and then we'll simulate again. Before we do that, I'm just going to decrease the resolution. I like to work at a pretty low resolution as far as just setting up our scene so that it's pretty quick to simulate. So we'll go back up to simulation and we'll press start. So now we can see our liquids coming in. They have a nice smooth look to them, and they happen to be dropping through the floor. So for setting up our liquids, this is the next thing we'll want to do, is go into the grid and adjust some of the settings for what happens when a fluid hits one of these walls. So if we go into the grid, you can see under boundary conditions, by default they're all open, which means when our fluid hits the boundary, it's just going to dissipate or die. If we click on X, you can see we have jammed minus, jammed plus, and jammed both. Jammed minus is just going to be one of these walls in X, and plus will be the other wall, and both will be both walls. So we're going to set jammed both to all of our walls, and then do a quick simulation again. So now when we click simulate, this fluid's going to come down, the liquid will hit the floor, and it's going to start spreading up, it's going to ripple and start pooling and things like that. So we can watch this kind of simulation happen. And while we do this, I'd like to take the opportunity to look at the preview. You can see right now under preview, we're previewing the fuel between 0.01 and 1, and those are the two colors we get. If we wish, we can adjust those colors, so maybe we can make it a little deeper blue if we wish, and kind of the bottom color maybe a little hotter white, maybe more of a cerulean if you wanted to. And you can play with those as much as you want. Because the fuel is emitting at 1, these are good values in order to kind of see what's happening in our simulation. So we'll let this just kind of simulate through. And once it's done, we can play back. And you'll see we have a nice fluid simulation, pretty quick to simulate and adjust. Now, depending on what you want to do with your simulation, you want to adjust the grid and the cell size in order to give you a higher resolution setup. So for now, we'll take this on and move on to the rendering setup. When I click on render here, you can see we don't really get any rendering. And that's because in order to render this with its implicit ISO surface, we need to switch our renderer to vray, and we need to set a couple of rendering parameters. So let's go ahead into the render dialog and go to assign renderer, and we're going to choose vray as our default renderer. Now we're going to go to the rendering rollout of our simulator, and we need to set a couple of parameters here. The first thing you want to set is to enable geometry mode under this vray setup. So we're going to check geometry mode, and we're also going to check solid mode so that we're rendering a solid surface for this object. When we do that, we need to actually decide what channel is going to be producing that solid surface, and that's done from this effects channel drop down here. Right now it's set to temperature, but of course we used fuel, so we're going to click on fuel, and that's going to set pretty much everything we need in order to get a solid surface out of this. If we go and render this out, now we'll see our solid surface rendered out in vray. There are some adjustments that can be made here, so you can adjust the surface level. If I brought this up to maybe 0.5, the surface would get a little bit thinner and possibly more detailed in places. It really kind of depends on the balance between the grid size and the surface level that you want to tune here. So this is a good place to kind of tune the way that your surface is getting generated when it renders out. So now that we actually have a surface, let's apply a material to this. We can hop into our material editor and apply any material we want. You can just kind of drag and drop it on the simulator, and then you'll see that that material will get used. And of course, if we want to set this to a little bit more of a complex material, we can open this up and grab a vray power shader. So we'll grab the vray material and set up some things for reflection. I'll make it slightly reflective. We'll give it a rich and kind of dark blue color. And I'll set the highlight so that we have a nice kind of sharp highlight on here. And then we'll scroll down and make it quite transparent. And we can render that out. Of course, with any transparent material, it's going to heavily depend on the environment. So, normally you'd have this set up in a scene with many objects to reflect and refract. In our case, we'll just add a quick environment into the environment map. So we can click on here and just add a gradient ramp. We'll drag that gradient ramp into the material editor as an instance. And under angle, we'll set it to 90. And under mapping, we'll set a cylindrical environment. This will just give us something nice to refract in the background. So now we can render that out. And you can see we have a nice water material with some pretty good details as far as the simulation goes. If this was for production, we certainly would decrease the grid size quite a bit, and let it render out in or simulate out in maybe 10 or 20 minutes as opposed to a few seconds like we have here. Now, if we want to take this and have it interact with any objects in the scene or fill a volume, we can certainly do that, and that's really the same way that you would do introducing collision objects and things like that with flames and smoke. To do this, I'm just going to go and create some geometry. So I'll create a basic sphere here and move it into the volume, kind of in the path of our emitting liquid. And then in the simulator, we'll just have to simulate this again. Everything that is inside this volume is automatically going to be collided with, or if you had, a cup or a glass, you could fill that object like so. And I'm just actually going to go to the grid, and we'll increase our resolution once, just so we can really see this kind of flow over here. And of course we need to simulate this again. So we'll go to Simulation and click on Start. And we can see this start to kind of pour into the volume and cascade over our mesh. And then it's going to drop to the floor and start kind of filling up that volume. So if we want to render this out, we can see how our liquid interacts with our object. Now, one thing to notice here is as I increase the resolution, the surface level has changed slightly because there's more resolution in the grid. So that's a good thing to adjust. And if we go over to our rendering options, we can set that surface level maybe down a little bit lower. So maybe we'll set that back down to a 0.2 because we have more resolution to play with, so that we can keep this fluid all staying together the way that we want. And now when you render that out, we can see the liquid kind of pouring over the surface as well as filling the volume at the bottom here. And another nice thing that you can see is, of course, we're interacting with the volume, we're rendering it, we're changing some of the parameters as it's simulating, which is a nice kind of workflow to be able to change these things as you're working and as you're simulating. So that's a quick introduction on how to create fluids using Phoenix, how to get them to collide with different objects, render out in your scene, adjust their surface, and adjust the grid so that you can get a better surface out of it. Thank you very much.